Hi, and welcome to the second lecture in our class on Islamic civilization. By now, I will have met you in person. At least I hope that's where this goes. I'm actually recording this way in advance. So I do hope that things went well on Tuesday and that we're getting the hang of these recorded lectures. Today, I'm going to be departing significantly from the Berkey reading because he's not that interested in the Quran and the history of Islam in the same way that we are in this class. So I'm going to build on what he gives us and then add some additional information I think is important, especially in the way that we're going to be approaching artifacts and manuscripts in the first couple of weeks of this class. So again, I'm spending a little more time on the emergence of Islam, looking at the Arabian context, as does Berkey, but then telling you a little bit about Muhammad's story and giving some background of the conquests, the development of the Quran, and the first caliphs. I'll explain more about this in a minute. I want to begin, though, by going over some of the key terms that we covered last time, making sure that you understand the difference between the Byzantine, Roman, and Greek Empire. That's all the same, right? Versus the Sassanid or Persian Empire. These two major empires are fundamental to understanding the emergence of Islam, as well as different religions. We mentioned Judaism, but of course Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism. These last two may not be as familiar to you, so make sure you do understand the difference among these. Now, in terms of the study of Islamic civilization to begin with, we also have to deal with a couple of multiple spellings. For instance, Muslim and Moslem are spelled in different ways. Quran and Qur'an are spelled in different ways. They are, of course, the very same words in Arabic. And so you need to develop a little flexibility in these multiple spellings. Islam, of course, is the name of the religion. A Muslim is an adherent of Islam. So similarly, Christianity is the religion, but a Christian is an adherent of Christianity. And the Quran is the holy book of Islam. Mecca is the city where the Prophet was born. Medina is the city where, in many ways, Islam grew up and became the first capital of the beginnings of the Islamic empire. And Arabia, then, is the general term for this peninsula of land where Mecca and Medina sit. The name of God in Arabic is Allah, which simply means the God or just God. So although this is sometimes thought of as a personal name for God that's unique to Islam, in fact, in Arabic, if you read, for instance, the Christian Gospels in Arabic, Jesus is referred to as the son of Allah, Ibn Allah, so in this case, Allah is just simply understood as a God, not specifically the God of Muslims. Muhammad is the name of the Prophet of Islam. And then a couple of terms that we'll be throwing around the next couple of weeks. The Hijra is an event. This is the emigration from Mecca to Medina in the Prophet's life. I'll cover this in just a minute. The Caliph is the name of the leader of the Muslim world who comes after the Prophet Muhammad. So we have, and I'll be talking about the first four caliphs. So the first four leaders of the Islamic world after Muhammad dies. A hadith is a story or a tradition, a narrative that's passed on initially orally and then eventually written down. This can be about anything, but the hadiths that retain the words or the deeds of the Prophet Muhammad are held to be a religious source next in priority to the Quran. So the Quran, of course, is understood as the word of God, so it has a very high status. And next to that are these collections of hadith. Sunni, Shi'i, and Sufi refers to different kinds of Muslims. The categories only develop much later, so around 800, 900, you start to see these categories come about. Today, we understand Shi'ism to be the smaller of the two. So in a way, we can only really say that Sunnism and Shi'ism are different kinds of ways of practicing Islam. You can be a Sufi that is a devotee of a spiritual practice and be either a Sunni or a Shi'i. I'll be talking more about these terms as we go on, and we'll add lots of detail and historical context to them. But I want you to be familiar with these terms so that when you see them, you'll have an idea of what we're talking about. Again, in our class discussion, please bring any questions about these or any additional terms that you want me to explain, just so that we're all on the same page. If you've got a question about what something means, undoubtedly somebody else does too. Berkey's questions. So we talked a little bit on Tuesday about how Berkey approaches the material. He is really skeptical. He wants to know how we can know about any of this. He's particularly skeptical about what he calls a teleological view of history. Teleology, telos is a goal. And so teleology is a goal-oriented way of telling a story. And what he's nervous about is looking to the past and looking at the evidence of the past, already knowing how the story comes out. And so therefore, reading that evidence, looking for an answer that we already know to be the case. So we do this a lot in the study of history, and it can really blind us to what the materials are actually possibly telling us. So that's why he's concerned about this teleological view. He also uses the German term Heilsgeschichte, which is salvation history. And it's a similar kind of thing. We already know from the Muslim perspective especially, right, that you have this savior figure of Muhammad coming and bringing this new religion to the world to save it in many ways. And so the success and the mission of Islam becomes very much a part of the history telling, especially among Muslims themselves. So we want to be a little skeptical about the histories of Islam told by Muslims, and look then at some of the broader history. So to what extent, for example, does Muhammad appear in Syriac sources? These are Christian sources coming from the area. Syriac is another Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. And so in these sources, they're not Muslim sources. What can they tell us about the rise of Islam? So there are very few mentions, but the ones we have are interesting and important. We want to pay attention to them. We note that Muhammad does not appear in the Byzantine Greek histories of the time. There is reference, of course, to the Arabs and to their rising up. And as Berkey mentions, some of these Arab tribes have already aligned themselves with the Byzantine Empire. Their support of this new Arabian set of conquests is part of the reason why the conquests were so successful. But Muhammad himself does not appear in Byzantine sources. We don't have a lot of material evidence about the rise of Islam, actual physical manuscripts or any coins or other kinds of physical artifacts. We want to talk about artifacts. We're going to be spending a lot of time looking at artifacts. And of course, my personal interest is in manuscripts. So reading my book on the history of Arabic manuscripts. And what I mean by a literary manuscript is a manuscript that's not a document. We have early documents. I'll show you an example of one in this lecture. We've got early documents written on papyrus. These are tax receipts. These are correspondence, bureaucratic pieces of evidence. But in terms of a literary manuscript, so a manuscript that tells a story, a manuscript that the first one is actually the history of King David. The earliest one we can date is 200 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So we have this dearth of physical evidence, and we have to work with what we have in order to retell this story. Now, here's an example of that very history of King David that I mentioned. You can see that, like all of our very early manuscripts, it's a fragment. This is on papyrus, and you can see here even the grain of the papyrus. Papyrus is a reed, and the reed is split and flattened and then woven together in order to create a writing service. The writing here is in Arabic, and all Arabic begins on the right and moves left, unlike English. And the title is written right here, Hadith Dawood. So this is a lot of questions about this particular manuscript and the way it was dated. Obviously, the work of filling in the missing words here is incredible work, not done by me, but by a papyrologist, Rafe Shorshkhori, who used other texts to fill in, imagine what was missing here. So this has been studied extensively. I've seen the original myself, which is now in Heidelberg, Germany. So what's lost in all of this, in this problem of evidence? Part of the issue is, what do we know about the nature of these early Islamic conquests, these fascinating historical events where the Persian Empire falls and much of the Byzantine Empire is lost? So what can we know about this? Were they in fact Islamic conquests? Was Islam a major motivating factor in these conquests? Were they Arab conquests? To what extent does this represent an ethnographic and ethnic outpouring of a particular kinds of peoples? So all of this question, of course, the military aspect of it, all of this, we don't have a lot of sources, and we run the risk of misunderstanding what the conquests are all about by only reading them through one or another view of history. And the same thing's true about the Qur'an and the early community of Muslims themselves. We have lots and lots of questions about this. And as we'll see, even the Muslim story about the Qur'an and about the early Muslim community is not a single story at all. There are actually many strands of story about this early period that we can see in the Muslim sources themselves. And so we have many questions in order to try to understand what was going on and where this impressive religious tradition and impressive set of military conquests came from. So our options, along a set of categories that we can stretch out. On the one hand, we have the very skeptical position of saying we can't really know anything, and that maybe Muhammad didn't even exist, and maybe all this was made up by later generations. How could we possibly know? And on the other hand, the sanguine position, the believer position, not just by Muslims, but by non-Muslim scholars as well, suggests that even the stories that are told, even these myths, must have some basis in reality. And all we need to do is to try to pick the reality out. And so a lot of methodologies have been created to try to figure out what the correct kernel of truth is in these stories. Now, I am interested in both these positions. Personally, as a scholar, I'm probably a little bit more on the skeptical side, but as a student of religion, I'm really interested in this sanguine side, because the fact of belief and the way that religious people understand history is central to what I think is interesting and important about history. So while I myself may be a little bit more on the skeptical side, I really honor and am interested and think it's terribly important that we pay close attention to this sanguine side. So what can we actually know about the Arabian context? Well, one thing we know is that the Arabic language was an ancient language. The first mention of Arabic words we have actually in the Hebrew scriptures of the Bible, so that we know that this language existed hundreds of years before Jesus Christ, more than 1,000 years before Muhammad, but it was not written down. There was no Arabic script until just before Muhammad. In fact, the first evidence we have of written Arabic is in what's called Nabatean script. The Nabateans are the peoples who built the city of Petra. You may be familiar with this image. I've been to Petra. It's an amazing place. This, of course, is, Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail. So one of the Indiana Jones movies is shot here on site. There's nowhere to go inside the treasury. It's not really a big chamber inside there, I'm sorry to say. But in the walls of the city of Petra are carved out, again, the script here is the Nabatean script, but the language that's being written is Arabic. And so we have a few lines of poetry that were written down on these walls that tell us that during the Nabatean period, we have some writing that tells us that Arabic was a commonly understood and used language in that period. We also know down in Yemen, and this is mentioned by Berkey, that Yemen was a crossroads. Yemen is to the south of Mecca and Medina. I'll show you on a map in just a minute. This is an area of highlands that receives some of the monsoonal rains coming across from South Asia over to East Africa. And so it's a place of agriculture, a place of a much higher civilization than what we had in Mecca and Medina at this time. And here are some of the images, the bronze sculpture on top, the stone sculpture to the bottom. And here we see both Byzantine and Persian influences in this area of Yemen. And as Berkey mentions, we have Jewish and Christian communities down in Yemen, a much bigger and more diverse set of religious traditions and cultural traditions in Arabia. So with Petra to the north and Yemen to the south, the area of Arabia was a place of cross-cultural influences. It's not in any way that it was separate from the Byzantine, Persian, and indeed the Ethiopian empires, but rather was a place where these influences mixed and were brought together. The religious traditions in Arabia, then, in addition to these Christian and Christian and Jewish communities that were there, some Zoroastrians up to the north, but not in the area of Mecca and Medina, the majority of people probably believed in a veneration of places and natural forces. There is mention of Allah as a god in Arabia beforehand, and Allah having 3 daughters. Now, how we know about most of this is, again, through Muslim sources themselves. There's a book called The Book of Idols that was written by a Muslim scholar 200 years after the death of the Prophet. And yet we also do have some inscriptions and other material that tell us that these different gods and goddesses were worshipped and venerated in this area. And the Kaaba, we're told, existed. So again, the Kaaba is this central shrine in Mecca. It is the big cube that Muslims walk around during the pilgrimage. So this, by both Muslim and non-Muslim accounts, was a shrine, a site of religious practice before Islam. And the Quran itself was not written down initially, but at first was an oral text revealed to the Prophet Muhammad piecemeal, bit by bit, over the course of his lifetime. The notion of Qur'an, which in Arabic just means recitation, is not unique to Islam either. And again, this is from Muslim sources that we know that there were other preachers, other holy people who had Qur'ans of their own, who would have these recitations. One was even mentioned by name, Musaylama, had a separate Qur'an, and he was an anti-prophet. He was not a Muslim, but he also had this group of recitations, and he would go around preaching. And so the very idea of Muhammad being a preacher, Muhammad having revelation and preaching a revelation, was not something that was terribly unusual in the world of Arabia at the rise of Islam. Now, as promised, here's a map for you. The Yemen down here to the south, Sana'a is here to the north, and this area right here is an area of highlands that then receives some of the rains that come across from the Indian Ocean, then here to East Africa. Mecca and Medina are here. Again, Mecca is a crossroads, so there is a trading route that goes through Mecca and also relatively close to the Red Sea. So there was a trade route then down there, and the Red Sea, like all seas, was a highway of sorts connecting Mecca to Egypt and down to Ethiopia to the south. Medina, however, was an oasis. And, you know, Berkey talks about urban environments. We have to remember that Mecca and Medina were very small places, much smaller than State College. So these are not large towns by any means. We're talking about a couple of thousand inhabitants, perhaps, and those spread out, and not all of those permanent inhabitants either. So we're told that Mecca in particular, people were connected to nomadic tribes, and there were semi-nomadic peoples who were sometimes in Mecca and sometimes in the outside. So we have to take this notion of an urban environment with a grain of salt. Jerusalem, you'll see up here, these are the outlines of modern nation states, and Karbala happens to be on this map. That's an important site we'll talk about later. But again, the Tigris River here, Euphrates over here, this is where the modern capital of Baghdad is of Iraq and where the ancient capital of Ctesiphon was. So what we see here is that the Persian Empire and the heart of the Persian Empire was actually very close to Mecca and Medina, much closer than the Byzantine Empire, which is way off here. Egypt also is relatively close, again, compared to Constantinople, way off the map to the north. And one last point as I'm looking at this map is to mention the Arab tribes that had been Christianized by the time of the rise of Islam. So Berkey mentions the Ghassanid tribe here in the modern nation state of Syria. That was their location. And they were connected to the Byzantine Empire. But down here in Iraq, there was the Lakhmid tribe, which was an armed buffer state that was connected to the Sassanid Empire. And so the fact is that Arabs here in the north, Petra, by the way, is right down here, and Arabs to the south were already connected closely with these other major empires. Now, the fact that Mecca and Medina are off to the side of these big empires doesn't mean that they were disconnected, but that they were less central and of lower population than areas like the Yemen and Syria and Iraq. The Kaaba, this is a picture from the 1960s, which I like very much because it gives you an idea of the topography of the area. And even in the 60s, there's still some of this traditional architecture that you'll still see in areas of Arabia and down in the Yemen. These brick multi-story buildings that, again, existed back in the period even that we're studying. But the Kaaba itself is this big cubic building, and to perform the pilgrimage, you walk around it. Around the Kaaba also is the Mosque of Mecca. That is a series of arcades that can accommodate many more people to walk around, or the technical term is circumambulate, the tawaf in Arabic, around this area. Now, I want to give you a modern picture to let you know kind of what things look like today. Saudi Arabia, of course, is a very wealthy state that has continued to build and build and build around the Kaaba. Now, the Kaaba itself looks pretty small because this whole mosque has been greatly expanded to accommodate the millions of pilgrims that go there every year, not so much during COVID times, but certainly otherwise, as well as these gigantic high-rise hotels that have been built, and this one that even looks like Big Ben. With Allah here at the top of this clock. So the whole world of Mecca has transformed enormously with the wealth that Saudis and others have poured into this city. So who was Muhammad? Muhammad is the son of Abdallah. That's what this B period stands for. Ibn Muhammad ibn Abdallah, we would say, Muhammad, the son of Abdallah. Abdallah, his father, even this name, the Abdallah, means a servant of God. He was born at around 570 and died around 630 of the Common Era. That's what CE stands for, the Common Era or Christian Era. Muslims have their own calendar, which is, I'll talk about in just a second. He was a merchant, was involved in running caravans until about the age 40, when he started to think about the world and the injustices of the world. 40 we should understand biblically as just a big number, 40 days and 40 nights. The ark was on the waters during the Noah period. 40 years, the people, the Hebrews wandered in the desert. 40 days, Jesus spent in the desert. So 40 just means a big, long time. So somewhere midlife, Muhammad had a bit of a crisis and was retreating into a cave in the Mount of Hira, just one of these hills just outside of the town of Mecca, and received this command he understood from God saying, recite, Iqra. And Iqra in Arabic is the very same word as Qur'an, it's related. So recite. And Muhammad's response was, what shall I recite? And then the first verse of the first surah of the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, traditionally in this year 610. It took a couple of years for Muhammad to begin preaching, to receive enough Quran and receive the courage to start preaching this new religious tradition in his hometown of Mecca. He was not well received, and eventually he and his followers had to flee to this other city of Medina. Now, Medina actually in Arabic just means city or place of residence, and it's actually short for Medinat an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet Muhammad. Its name at that point was Yathrib, and so Muhammad and his followers flee to this oasis of what's now called Medina. The altercations with the Meccans did not end, and there were a number of battles. So after 622 is the first time that there is an idea of jihad as warfare attached to this early religious movement around Muhammad. So this Battle of Badr, and I really put battle here in air quotes because only a few people died in this Battle of Badr. We're to understand this more as a skirmish, as an armed skirmish between peoples, a brawl, if you will. This was seen as a victory for this early community and was the beginning of a series of victories, of military victories, that then ended in 630 with the incorporation of Mecca into this expanding territory, now including Mecca and Medina. And when Muhammad dies in 632, these two cities are unified. But that's it. It's really all there is to the Muslim world at the time of the Prophet's death. So who is Muhammad? Who was Muhammad? From the Quran itself, from Muhammad's own statements, we are to understand that he's not divine. So in this sense, he is rejecting the view of Christians of Jesus, who was considered to be divine. He's rejecting this idea that the prophet is a divine figure. He's just a human being. And in this idea of being a prophet, of reciting stories, and for instance, the story of Noah is in the Quran, the story of Adam, the story of Jesus is in the Quran. These biblical stories are there, and in reciting these, he's explicitly connecting himself to the traditions of Judaism and Christianity. On the other hand, we also see his response to local Arabian traditions. And as Berkey mentions, one of the key figures in Arabia previous to the rise of Islam, and even today, is the poet. Now, poetry doesn't have a big claim on our moral imagination these days, but in Arabia, it really does. And part of this has to do with the fact that Arabic poetry is really intense. It is complex, and it's interesting, and it has a kind of almost divinity to it, because you think, how could anybody produce such a beautiful, complex combination of words and ideas. So poets were held to be possessed by a little shaitan, a little Satan, who would whisper in the poet's ear these ideas, and then the poet would write them down. So held to be almost divine. Think of this as the muse of ancient Greece, for example, the semi-divine figure who communicates things that inspire, right? We even have this word in English, inspire, to inspirit a person, to inspire you with ideas. So he rejects this. He's not a poet. He's not possessed by spirits in this way. And in this sense, Muhammad is responding to these local belief systems, rejecting the worship or the veneration of places and rejecting these other gods and goddesses and saying there's only one God, and that is Allah. So the Quran then, as I said, is the key religious text of Islam. It is a book that's understood as being the very word of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over 22 years of his life. And so therefore, its 114 chapters can be separated into those revelations that came to him during his period in Mecca and those revelations that came to him during his period in Medina. Because he continued to receive revelation over his life, it was never collected until after he died. And the very process of the collection of the Quran is something that we'll talk about, and the writing down of the Quran is something we'll talk about more in our section on the Quran. The best way to describe the Quran is as prophetic literature. So if you're familiar at all with the Hebrew scriptures, the Nabatean, the writings of the prophets, things like Hosea and Micah and Isaiah, you'll see that there is a similarity to that kind of writing as compared to what we see in the Quran. It's what I call referential literature. It refers to things. It doesn't tell stories. It doesn't have poetry in it. It doesn't contain wise sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad barely appears. The history of the early community does not appear at all in this. It is understood as a perfection of the Torah, the Hebrew scriptures, and of the Gospels. It retells a lot of those stories and retells them as lessons for people to understand. Here is one of the earliest written Qurans that we know of. This is not actually dated, and the use of carbon dating is also problematic. We'll talk about this in more detail. One of the things you can see here is, again, the Arabic script runs from right to left. Arabic script, as well as Hebrew, usually includes other markings above this regular script, such as lines that tell you what vowel is to be attached to this, and also dots that differentiate one letter from another. So, for instance, this we read as Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and that first initial stroke here is a B. But it should have, if we're writing Arabic today, we'd have a dot at the bottom to let us know it's a B. Otherwise, there could be two dots at the top, which would be a T, or three dots at the top, which would be a TH, a th, or two dots at the bottom, which would be a yeah, a Y. So this one little stroke here can actually be 5 different consonants. And then Bismillah, that tells us there's if you will, an I, a vocalization under here, and then that would be a sukun that tells us you don't pronounce it, not basama, for example. You don't pronounce that S in a different way. So all of this is to say that early written Qurans are mnemonic devices. They are written for those who already know and have already memorized the text, just to remind them of what that text actually says. That's really the only way you can read this early manuscript. So again, as I promised very briefly, the history after Muhammad's death, we have his close companion and friend Abu Bakr, who only is caliph for 2 years after the Prophet's death. The history of Abu Bakr and the decision of the community To name him as the first leader is, of course, very fraught, and lots of stories about this, which we won't go into right now. I just want to have the 4 names because these names come up quite a bit. The second caliph, in fact, all 4 of these caliphs were close companions of the Prophet. The conquest of the Persian Empire and much of the Byzantine Empire happened under Omar's reign. These 10 years between the death of Abu Bakr in 634 and the death of Omar in 644. The next caliph is Uthman ibn Affan, who reigned for 12 years. And actually, Omar was killed by a Persian Christian slave who was upset about the conquest of the Persian Empire. Uthman was killed by other Muslims who were upset about the way that he was running things. So this is kind of a bloody history, and of course, therefore interesting. And there's lots of debate within the Muslim sources, not to mention modern sources, about all of this. But it is Uthman that we credit, or that tradition credits, with collecting the Quran, with first writing down an official version of the Quran, now 20 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And finally, the last of these first 4 caliphs was the Prophet's own son-in-law and cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who then was also killed during these civil wars. And this then is these are the 4 who continued ruling after Muhammad during the 40 years after Muhammad's death in 632. There's a lot more to talk about there. I just want you to have these 4 names and have them in order and have a sense of who they are, and we'll be talking about them much more as we go on. Here is our first example of Arabic writing as part of this. This actually was produced during the period of Omar's reign, the second caliph. And what you can see here is that we have Arabic. This is the same statement that began the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And this part down here is in Arabic, but above that, now written from left to right, is Greek. So one of the things this tells us, and we have many, many examples of this. In fact, we have no examples of this kind of tax receipts or bureaucratic writing solely in Arabic from the period of the Caliphs of Medina. What we have is all bilingual or trilingual. So Arabic, remember, has just become a written language. The language of bureaucracy in these former Byzantine territories is Greek. And if you want to run a bureaucracy, you need the bureaucrats who know that language. So this is just one sign for us that this conquest was not a complete revision and replacement of culture, but rather a transition from one culture to another that in fact takes at least 100 years. So the traditional view of the conquests is kind of mapped out in this way. I especially like that the first area here is in red with this connotation of violence and spread of Islam. In fact, none of this, I mean, most of this really is a lie. As I said before, these territories, for example, here are all desert. There's nobody who lives there, at least not very many people, and they certainly didn't become Muslim. What it does tell us, though, is the gradual movement of these military conquests. This one suggests that the whole area here was part of the Muslim world. That really cannot be the case. Mecca and Medina, perhaps, but even immediately after the death of the Prophet, there were revolts where tribes that considered themselves Muslim, that is submissive to Muhammad, when Muhammad died, they're like, okay, we're out of here. And so this very notion that this is part of a Muslim world really has to be qualified very carefully. But we do see that there were 3 initial directions to the conquest. So first up here to the Sassanid Empire. Now Baghdad is an anachronism There was no city of Baghdad at that point, but that is rather the city of Ctesiphon. And then the taking of this whole territory, which was in fact the Persian Empire. And then all this territory here from the Byzantine Empire. You'll note that this area is after the first 4 right-leg-guided caliphs I mentioned. So moving out here into northern Africa and then into the Andalusian Peninsula, all of that happens a little bit later, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the conquests begin, as I mentioned, with this first victory against the Persian Empire, and then the 642 Battle of Nihawand that really opens the entire empire to the Muslim forces, and the empire falls. Many stories about this and about the incomprehension of some of these desert Arabs of the wealth and the luxury that was in these Persian cities at that time. In the West, we have, on the one hand, the direct movement west to Egypt, also in 642. And Egypt, of course, was a very important province of the Roman Byzantine Empire, because Egypt, then as now as in ancient times, was a great producer of grain and of agricultural products. So that conquest of Egypt was strategically very important and a site of a lot of wealth equivalent to the territory of the Iraq in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates River. But those conquests continue on west. Kairouan is a place of particular importance to me, and you'll see I've got the dates here for you also of the movement through North Africa, across into the Spanish Peninsula, and even up into Poitiers, which is in the heart of modern-day France. When the Muslims battled against Charles Martel, who was one of the ancestors of Charlemagne. And again, here is another map showing these 3 movements. The one here first with the Battle of Qadisiyah, you can see here, and Nihawand being the important one in 642, that then being the defeat of the major part of the Persian Empire. And then all that territory being opened up to these invading Arab armies. And the second one, Heliopolis here in 640, but then Alexandria in 642. At this point, Alexandria is the chief city of Egypt. Fustat, where modern Cairo is, was just an outpost. And that then begins this movement. The important battle here in the area, Yarmouk is actually in modern Jordan, but up into Syria, into the province of Syria, was the Battle of Yarmouk here in 636, and then moving up north and taking all this territory. Now, again, it's worth remembering that while the defenders of these areas were Byzantine troops, all of this territory was actually under the rule of the Sassanid Persians until about 620. And so we have this area which had, again, only been reestablished as Byzantine about 20 years before the Muslims come in and take it. And how did they do that? Largely with these troops, these Arabs that were living in these border areas that had already been connected to the major empires of the Persian and the Byzantines. So that's where I'm going to end the story for right now. I remind you that on Tuesday, there'll be a quiz at the beginning of class. We'll start 5 minutes after the beginning of class at 1:40. Please bring a pencil or something else to write with. It doesn't have to be a number 2 pencil. I'm not going to be using Scantron forms for this. And we'll spend some time on Tuesday, again, with the very artifacts that I've talked about today, looking at some of these early bureaucratic papyri and also some of these Qur'an manuscripts. So please be sure to do the reading for Berkey, and hopefully we'll have a chance I'll have another lecture for you. We'll have a chance to delve into some of these artifacts in our discussion for next Tuesday. Have a great weekend.